Got it. Excellent. Let's do this. Welcome back to those of you who have been following along in our journey through the David story. And to those who are joining us for the first time this evening, you're in for a real treat. We will be looking at the narrative of David in his rise to power as he becomes King David. And then next week, we will see what kind of king he is. And we might call that his fall from power, but we'll leave that until next week. I like to think about this session and next month, I guess, these two sessions as how it started, how it's going. So tonight we're going to be working with David, how it started. And you know, what I want to say as we jump back into our narrative is that last month we looked at the character of Saul. We talked about how Saul was selected by God and what the on-ramp to his coronation looked like. And this evening, we will be looking at David, but you can't really look at David without also looking at Saul. So much of the narrative of David is in contrast to and in relationship with Saul. And so if you weren't with us last month, that's fine. We are going to talk about some of the things, the characteristics of Saul, and some of the challenges to Saul's character that play a pivotal role in David's leadership as well. So with that, we're going to get started. I prepared a little PowerPoint for us to jump in, and we'll be looking at several texts tonight, trying to pack in as much as we can to this class, this hour that we have together. We will also be exploring the sacred text of Michelangelo through our scholar in residence, Professor Adrienne Rubin, who will be interpreting our sacred text together. So we're going to be doing that in just a few minutes. What we're going to do is we're going to jump in, learn a little bit about David in his early descriptions in our sacred text. Then we'll be learning with Adrienne. And then we're going to continue our journey with David. So before I continue, are there any burning questions, things that people have been holding or want to know about? Good. Okay, great. So we're going to jump in. Let's do it. I'm going to share my screen now. We're going to explore the David story. Can everybody see my screen? Thumbs up? Yeah? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, great. So we're going to, sorry, let's just do this slideshow. The David story, narratives of David. So, Robert Alter, he titles his translation of the books of Samuel and Kings, The David Story, putting David really front and center in the way that we think about this narrative. And I think that we'll see over the course of this evening and our session next month, why that is, why David is the central figure. But I want us to think about that and think about, after, we survey all of these kings that we're exploring, what made David special, if anything? What makes him a unique king in this monarchy, in this monarchic succession? So We're going to look tonight at the first half of David's narrative in terms of 3 sections. What I call young David, Saul versus David, and King David. Okay. And next month we will come back together and we will talk more about King David in his later years. But tonight we'll begin with young David. So what do we want to know about young David? Well, last month, you may recall that we looked at this text, which I'm going to share now, and I'm going to make it big. Okay, here we go. So this is a text that we looked at last month together, because as I said, it is a story about Saul, but it's also our introduction to David. So we want to review this a little bit. And one of the things that I want to lift up in this text is the way that we as the readers get to meet David. Who is this David? This text is going to articulate that for us. So you may recall that we are with Saul, who is the king. And up until this point in the narrative, the first several chapters of the book of 1 Samuel, Saul is a military leader. He is a strong king. God is on his side, and he is a successful leader. People follow him, and especially in the military realm, Saul is crushing it. But then we get this introduction. Now the spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord began to terrify him. All of a sudden, our King Saul becomes challenged. He is no longer accompanied with the Spirit of God. We're not exactly sure what that means, but something has shifted in that. And also we understand that he's struggling with what they call in the text an evil spirit, which you might interpret today as almost a mental health crisis. Saul is struggling emotionally, and this will impact his leadership. So his courtiers suggest that they get somebody, a music therapist, who can help to soothe Saul through these terrors that he's experiencing. So Saul said to his courtiers, "Find me someone who can play well and bring him to me." And one of the attendants spoke up, "I have observed a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite." And this I put in bold because these are the descriptions that we want to pay attention to. Who is skilled in music, a stalwart fellow, and a warrior, an ish milchama, sensible in speech and handsome in appearance. Plus, God is with him. All right, so here we have this character. We don't even know his name, right? But we know that he possesses these important characteristics, which we will see unfold in this narrative. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, "Send me your son David, who is with the flock." So now, what else do we know about him? What else do we know about David? What kind of job does he have? He's a shepherd. Great. And is he a shepherd of asses like Saul?
No. The flock.
No, he's a shepherd of sheep. What good luck we have. We have a shepherd of sheep, which, as you might recall, was something that we were missing in Saul. Saul was a leader of donkeys who he, would stray, and he'd have to tug on them and pull them along. But here we have one of our traditional biblical models of leadership, a shepherd. someone who's used to leading from behind, keeping the flock together, unifier, right? So already without even, I'm bringing this up because this is really pre-David, right? This is the chapter right before, but already we're getting a deep introduction to who David is and what kind of leader we might expect. Now, that what's beautiful about the David story is that there's a lot of really rich literary foreshadowing. Every time you hear something in the David story, it's there for a reason. It's a big flashing light telling you, pay attention. Something we're going to use that later, right? It's the pistol on the mantle, right? Okay. So David comes to Saul and enters into his service. And Saul took a strong liking to him and made him one of his arms bearers. Saul sent word to Jesse asking that David remain in service. And it says, whenever the evil spirit of God came upon Saul, David would take his musical instrument, the lyre, and play it, and Saul would find relief and feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. Okay, so this is what we read last time. This is how David is introduced to us. David is introduced to us with a purpose of being a musical therapist for Saul, now that God has left him and he is possessed by an evil spirit. But in the introduction, we already know that David is much more than a musician, much more. He has characteristics of leadership that we are looking for and will now see how that plays itself out. Any questions so far? This is like a little bit review, but also new. Anybody have a question or a thought on this before we jump in? There'll be a lot to talk about, so don't feel eager, to ask a question unless you're really curious. Okay, let's keep going. So when we think of David, we often think of David and Goliath, right? This is the famous story, David and Goliath. One of the great literary and military metaphors of our lives. Even this week, I feel like we've heard that metaphor being used frequently with regard to the attacks on the Ukraine. The vision of an individual or a group of people who are outmatched by the person who is attacking them. But just a show of hands, how many people have read this story, David and Goliath, in the original? Just raise your hand high if that's you. Okay, so only a few of you have really spent time with this text. I'm so excited that we get to read it together tonight, you guys. It's so good. It's so good. And Adrienne can tell you how good it is because she tried to ask me a tachlis question about her job today. And I made her listen to the story of David and Goliath just because it was so good.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful.
I apologize, Adrienne. But
no, it was wonderful.
It's just so good. It's just delicious writing. It's really just, it's so good. So let's read it. Okay. Does anybody want to read so that I don't have to, you don't have to hear my voice for 1 hour? Would anybody be interested in a little dramatic reading tonight? I see Carol. Carol is going to volunteer. Okay, so Carol, listen, because in the interest of time, we're not going to read every word of this text. We're only going to read what you see in bold. Okay, and you also need to unmute so that we can also hear you.
Got it.
Awesome. All right, hit it.
A champion of the Philistine forces stepped forwards. His name was Goliath of Gath, and he was 6 cubits and a span tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a breastplate of scale armor, a bronze breastplate weighing 5,000 shekels. He had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung from his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's bar, and the iron head of his spear weighed 600 shekels, and the shield bearer marched in front of him. He stopped and called out to the ranks of Israel, and he said to them, "Why should you come out to engage in battle? I am the Philistine champion, and you are Saul's servants. Choose one of your men and let him come down against me. If he beats me in combat and kills me, we will become your slaves. But if I best him and kill him, you shall be our slaves and serve us." And the Philistine ended, "I herewith defy the ranks of Israel. Get me a man and let's fight it out." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and terror-stricken.
Okay, excellent. Okay, keep going.
Okay, where did you
Just
moved
at the
the-
top here. And David was the young-
David was the youngest. The three oldest had followed Saul, and David would go back and forth from attending on Saul to shepherd his father's flock at Bethlehem.
Okay, so let's just pause there for 1 second. So, oh my gosh, it's so good. This is such a good dramatic narrative. I mean, honestly, you never need to read another book if you have the David story. It's delicious. So we get this amazing, amazing opening into the story, right? This deeply rich visual description of Goliath of Gath. I mean, you can all see it, right? You can all really see this monster, this humongous man with all this armor, drama and pomp and circumstance. And we also get this description of David, right? Who is David? He's the youngest of a big family. And we know that there are other brothers in his family, and they are in the military. They're following Saul. That's what that means. Okay? But not David. Okay? We've got Goliath of Gath, huge military champion, and we've got David, who is not in any way close to that. What does David do all day? He goes back and forth from playing the musical instrument for Saul to tending to his flock. Okay? This is how we get introduced to David and Goliath. Okay. How are you feeling, Carol? Are you spent, or are you ready to do a little more?
I'm fine.
Awesome. Okay. So let's go here. So David with his
Okay.
baggage. Let's hear.
David left his baggage with the man in charge of the baggage and ran towards the battle line and went to greet his brothers. While he was talking to them, the champion, whose name was Goliath, the Philistine of Gath, stepped forward from the Philistine ranks and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. When the men of Israel saw the man, they fled in terror. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel? Who is that uncircumcised Philistine that he dares defy the ranks of the living God?"
Okay, let's keep going. Wait,
David-
here we go. Okay.
David said to Saul, "Let no man's courage fail him. Your servant will go and fight that Philistine." But Saul said to David, "You cannot go to that Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." David replied to Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. And if a lion or a bear came and carried off an animal from the flock, I would go after it and fight it and rescue it from its mouth. And if it attacked me, I would seize it by the beard and strike it down and kill it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and that uncircumcised Philistine shall end up like one of them, for he has defied the ranks of the living God. The Lord," David went on, "who saved me from lion and bear, will also save me from that Philistine." "Then go," Saul said to David, "and may the Lord be with you."
Okay, let's pause there for 1 second. 1 second. Amazing job, Carol. Thank you so much. Okay, so far what do we see about David's character?
He's brave.
Okay, he's brave, good. I mean,
Maybe he's foolish.
okay, maybe he's foolish, right? He's definitely fearless, right? What about the question that he's asking? What he's asking after this? What about that?
What are you going to do for me?
There's definitely a question of like, can this help me get ahead, right? We see that too. There's some kind of, opportunistic behavior, right?
But he also seems to be faithful.
Yes, he definitely has a belief that he wants to be on God's team and that God's team will be the winners, right? For sure. And that's a very important characteristic of this narrative, which we're going to see throughout Samuel and Kings, right? I mean, when you could call it the David story, but you could also call it the God story, right? Because God is really the main character in this narrative, right? God is the force that determines the leadership structure of this book. This book is largely predicated on where God is residing, with whom God's presence is, right? Okay, good. Other thoughts? Yeah, Keith.
So he's the youngest son, and Joseph was the youngest son, and he's
Joseph was the youngest son.
he was. Oh, there was Benjamin. Okay.
But yes, there are some really strong Joseph vibes in this narrative. One of the sections that we skipped is where Jesse, David's father, says basically, go and take care of your brothers. Here's some stuff. Take that to him, which we know is how the Joseph story also starts. It doesn't end well for Joseph in that particular episode. But there's the same kind of relationship where Joseph and David are kind of like, they stay with their dad and their brothers are like doing the work. And then something changes in that, something shifts, right? Okay, so let's keep going because I want us to get through this story and then learn from Adrienne. Okay, so we're here on verse 20, on 38. You want me to take over, Carol, or are you feeling strong?
I'm fine if you want me to continue.
Yes, it's awesome.
Saul clothed David in his own garment. He placed a bronze helmet on his head and fastened a breastplate on him. David girded his sword over his garment. Then he tried to walk, but he was not used to it. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk in these, for I am not used to them. So David took them off. He took his stick, picked a few smooth stones from the wadi, put them in the pocket of his shepherd's bag, and sling in hand, he went toward the Philistine.
Okay, I mean, really, honestly, what more do you need in a narrative? I mean, this boy, he's so brave, he's so fearless, and so the king gives him his own armor, and it's like the sword and the stone. It falls, he can't even walk. So he takes off all his armor, and he picks up a little stick. I mean, it's pure poetry. It's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. Okay, so this little boy is now, he's got no armor, got a little stick and some rocks, and let's see what happens next.
When the Philistine caught sight of David, he scorned him, for he was but a boy, ruddy and handsome. And the Philistine called out to David, Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? The Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come here, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. David replied to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel, whom you have defied. When the Philistine began to advance toward him again, David quickly ran up to the battle line to face the Philistine. David put his hand into the bag. He took out a stone and slung it. It struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Thus, David bested the Philistine with sling and stone. He struck him down and killed him. David had no sword, so David ran up and stood over the Philistine, grasped his sword, and pulled it from its sheath, and with it he dispatched him and cut off his head.
Okay, excellent. There's much more. There's about 50 more chapters, but we're going to pause there. Just quick reflections on this story before we hear from Adrienne.
I didn't realize we cut heads off. I thought that was more like when you see these terrible things today with the, with the terrorists.
Yeah. So why do you think he cut the head off? For any of you, ancient history buffs, what was that? Why was that important?
It was a
Is it a
sign of
trophy?
trophy. It was a trophy.
That's right. That's right. It was a sign of victory. And this is why, I love this line where it's like, he didn't have his own sword and he still had to cut the guy's head off. So he had to find a sword to cut his head off to get the trophy. Because that was a way that you would show that you were the victor in ancient history. And actually, I learned this a few months ago when I was in Tunisia, that in ancient times, you would also have statues of prominent figures in whatever villages or cities they ruled over. And when you invaded, you also took the head off of the statues as a sign that they were no longer in power. And this is one of the reasons why, when you go and take tours of places where like in ancient Rome and places where the ancient world, there's evidence of the ancient world, a lot of the statues will not have their heads. And that was because that was an act of aggression when there was an invasion or a war. Which is a great transition, I think, to exploring this story through works of art. I want to thank Adrienne for gracing us with her presence again, because it's a treat for me, and I imagine a real treat for all of you. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Adrienne.
Oh, thanks so much, Rabbi. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you. And thank you so much, as always, for the opportunity to bring a little art into your classes, which is something that I just love to do. Can you guys see this sort of fully or not so much? Better? Okay. So now that you have the background of the biblical text that is leading up to this moment, I think many of you know this sculpture. It is Michelangelo's David. I think the reason I'm talking about this tonight is because I happened to mention the word Michelangelo in the chat during Rabbi's first class when she said, what do we think of when, what associations do we have with David? I'm curious, I can't really see while I'm screen sharing, but I will try to scroll through. Have any of you seen this in person? Okay, Nice and Vams, I see a lot of head shaking. Okay, fantastic, fantastic. I mean, no sacrilegious intent, intended here, but it is sort of like a quasi-religious moment, I think, when you walk into the Gallery l'Accademia and you see David in all of his grandeur and all of, that size. He's 14 feet tall, spot lit by the natural skylight above him. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible. So we see David being portrayed here in a really, really sort of interesting way. There are classical elements, and then there are elements that are very specific to the Renaissance as well. So he is being depicted here before going into his battle with Goliath, which right away separates Michelangelo's depiction from many other depictions of David, where he's usually shown post-battle with Goliath, often sort of stepping on or adjacent to the severed head of Goliath. So here you see him preparing for battle. He rather jauntily, in my opinion, has, the slingshot over his shoulder, sort of contemplating what's to come, but I think showing the great bravery and kind of concentration needed to get him through this moment, and the bravery that has been, described in Samuel 1 in chapter 17. We know from Michelangelo, what we know of Michelangelo, that he had an incredible sense of human anatomy. And I'm sorry, I can see, I don't think there's any way for me to enlarge this in this context, but you can see just from looking at it here that he has this incredible sense of muscles, veins. I mean, I wish I had one of the pointers like from an art history in-person class. You can see the veins in David's hands
We
and in
can
his
see
chest.
your mouse.
You can. Okay, good. I wasn't sure. Okay, great. Thank you. So I don't need my little light. I mean, it's just his sense of anatomy is amazing. So a few things. That said, there are a few things here that are not particularly anatomically correct. David's head is very oversized. David's right hand is very oversized. Part of the reasoning for that is that this sculpture was originally intended to go stories above human, eye level, in the facade of the Opera del Duomo, which is the Cathedral of Florence. So the idea is that he was exaggerating these features so that they would be evident to the, to the viewer, to the spectator, to the beholder, even from ground level. But of course, there's another interpretation of his, sort of giant head and giant hand, which are David, while he was certainly, a brave fighter and a man of action, he was also a thinker. And, this is sort of reflective of both his contemplative skills and his physical strength, I think. Most interesting and most often commented upon is what's called his Contrapposto Pose, which is a pose that actually dates back to ancient Greece, where it was meant, instead of, the very sort of linear, stand up straight, weight evenly divided on both legs pose that we most often associate with classical Greek sculpture, this emerged a bit later in Greek sculpture as a way of just giving more dynamism to figures. So what it is you see that his weight is largely on his right leg. He's mainly putting his weight on there. He's supported by a tree trunk in back, which is a sort of common trope within sculpture. What this does is it means that his other leg, his left leg, is bent, the knee is out, and this creates a sort of S-like contour throughout his whole body because his hip and his shoulder are kind of at opposing angles, which creates a nice kind of sense of dynamism there. And also the tilt of his head plays into this contrapposto pose. A few things about Michelangelo. This sculpture was created between 1501 and 1504. He was 26 years old when he was commissioned to do this. That said, he was, I think, the highest paid and most highly regarded sculptor in Florence at that time, despite his young age. For a little bit of context, this was some years, not many, before he started painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which he worked on from 1508 to 1512. So truly the epitome of a Renaissance man, that he had all of this talent to do these things. Another thing that I always find very poetic and beautiful, really, and very fitting for this highly idealized and sort of perfect vision of David as hero, was that Michelangelo had this concept that whatever sculpture he was working on was already there in the marble, and he was liberating it with his chisel. It was there just waiting to emerge, and he was kind of the agent or the intercessor, or whatever you want to call it, that was enabling that sculpture to emerge. So I'm using the word sculpture, and Rabbi Schachter and I had an interesting conversation a day or two ago. Is it a sculpture or is it a statue? And actually, that's a question that I am going to pose to you guys. I don't know if you want me to leave it up for a few minutes. If you think there's any distinction between a sculpture and a statue, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that. It's easier to see you if I take the sculpture down, but I think it's kind of important to have the visual while we're having a discussion. So if anybody wants to chime in, I would
can
love to hear
scroll,
your-
so.
Okay, thanks, Rabbi. Richard Lasky, I see your hand.
To me, the difference between a sculpture and a statue is that the word sculpture focuses on the sculptor, whereas statue focuses on the subject.
Great.
So it's both things, but it depends on why it interests you, I think, in some way.
Mhm.
I think, Michelangelo is so good at sculpting that although, we might have some kind of a, mushbucha relationship with David, but the sculpting is really amazing.
I mean, it's incredible. It is absolutely incredible. All right, I love that. Thanks, Richard. So it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of, who's doing the perceiving, and maybe also a bit of context, what the purpose is of the work of art. Any other ideas? And then Rabbi, I'll turn it back over to you in a minute. Thanks. I know it's taking a bit of time.
Not at all.
Anybody else? All right, well,
Lynn Levine, I see Lynn.
Lynn, I'm sorry. I don't know why I didn't see your hand.
That's
Lynn,
okay.
I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I
Hi,
was-
Lynn. I'm glad you got on.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the help.
Oh, anytime.
I don't know. I just think of sculpture referring to the art, and statue referring to in memory or in honor of someone.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I think what Rabbi Schachter and I came to was that this is sort of both. I mean, certainly, I don't think anybody could contest the fact that it is a sculpture, but he's 14 feet tall. He's being portrayed as hero, and it's meant to elicit that sense of awe and that sense of wonder and appreciation that I think is, typically characteristic of why statues are created as well. All right, thanks everybody. It's always a joy to share with you, and thanks Rabbi for the opportunity as always.
Thank you, Adrienne. What a treat. I'm just so glad that we got to look at that sculpture and have that added visual to our already very visually rich narrative, because I think that this session where we are spending time with David is all about David's confidence, David's heroism, David being on top of the world, right? And even in this moment in his life where he is a shepherd, we know based on the way that he is perceived by other people, the way he's described, that he's a winner, right? He's good looking, he's confident, he's athletic, he's, successful, he's a musician, he's every high school girl's crush. Let's be real. And I think that Michelangelo really captures that in this gorgeous nude man, right? Who is about to take on the enemy of the people with confidence and with ease, right? He's not trembling, he's not fearful. He's got his Contrapposto pose, he's chilling and he's ready. So I want to go back to my slideshow here. So I made a little chart, right? So what we might say are some of the differences between Saul and David, and what are some of the similarities, right? So last week we looked at the list on the left. This was something that we looked at together. We said that when we were introduced to Saul, we were introduced with striking physical characteristics. I don't know if you remember, but Saul was also very good looking, very handsome, very big, very tall, head and shoulders above all the people, remember? He was a giant. Oops, sorry, I'm so sorry, okay. But we also know that he had some odd things about him, right? He was a shepherd, but of donkeys. He loses his donkeys. He seems to be dwelling on the donkeys. Even when he meets a prophet who basically says, you're going to be the king now, he's like, but what about my donkeys? Which brings me to the next point, that he's a little bit politically oblivious, right? He doesn't really seem to get it. In fact, when he's called upon to be king, he hides in the baggage. There we have the scene where it's like, where's Saul? And he's literally cowering behind the baggage. We don't know why. And then he basically says, please go away. Maybe if I stay hiding behind this baggage, I don't have to be the king. But then we see a shift in Saul. We see that his reluctancy turns to insecurity. He doesn't want people to be making fun of him. He wants people to take him seriously, and he becomes a very aggressive and successful military hero. David also has striking physical characteristics. What a handsome man. We hear that in twice in one paragraph, that he's a good-looking guy. We know that he's a shepherd of sheep, and that he's a talented musician. So he has the temperament to be gentle. He's the youngest. He's small, in contrast to Saul, who is a big guy, very, takes up a lot of room, has a lot of physical presence. We don't get that sense from David. And then we see in the episode that we just saw that he's not politically oblivious, but rather a savvy person. He's asking the right questions. He's also talking to the right people, right? He asks what's in it for him, and then he himself goes before the king, right? And says, I'm going to slay this giant for you. Chutzpah, he's got chutzpah. He requests military leadership. In fact, one of the nice little literary parallels that I love in the narrative that we just read is that, in contrast to Saul, who physically hides behind the baggage, this text tells us that whatever baggage David has, he leaves behind. That's what it says. It says he had a bunch of baggage, and he left it with the person who watches baggage in order to become a new person, to become our hero, and eventually our king. Questions about this chart so far? Yep, Keith?
Why does Saul trust David? I mean, this is a big responsibility. If the little shepherd boy loses to the giant, Israel becomes enslaved to the Philistines. He's got other than his bravado, no bona fides as a soldier in any way. I mean, he kills the bear, but he's not a proven warrior.
Absolutely right. The stakes are super high, right? Great question. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I think that's an amazing question. I mean,
Yeah, because if David didn't do it, he'd have to do it himself, and he didn't want to try.
Okay, so maybe Saul feels like nobody's stepping up, right? I mean, we don't know like kind of what the timeline is here, but there's this challenge hanging out there, this imminent threat. And David volunteers himself. But it's an excellent question because it doesn't sound like a small deal, right? It definitely sounds like a big deal. Other thoughts?
I think whoever wrote this story for the Bible went out of their way to make Saul look and seem like a weaker character, which only builds up David and makes him more prominent when he comes on the scene. So you have a weaker character that was written into the story, and then this Superman comes along, or Superboy comes along, and fills some rather big shoes or sandals.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. In fact, I just want to take a small detour to say that we get that not just in a subtle way, Andy, but an extremely explicit way, where if we scroll down here, everybody see my screen? So I'm just looking. So over the course of the narrative, we get bombarded with that image where as the narrative continues through Saul's life before David becomes king, we get lines like this. If you look here, 2 Samuel, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long drawn out, but David kept growing stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker. This is actually a very prominent theme that we see, and it begins here in this story, which is what I want to look at together. So if everybody can see here, 1 Samuel 18. At first, right? So David comes back from this battle, and things are going well for David. Okay, Saul is like, awesome, you're my man, I love you, you're so good looking, you play that lyre, it's so awesome. And it says, when David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up in the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. And Saul took David into his service that day and would not let him return to his father's house. So we see this shift, this very short-lived moment where Saul and David are simpatico, and Saul really adopts David into his family. And it's a big love fest. And Saul invites David into his children's lives. Jonathan, Michal, all of these people become David's people. And one of the big themes that we see in this section of our sacred text is how much everybody loves David. It uses these words over and over again. That these people fall in love with David. They love David. They use the word ahava. They love that there's so much love around David. What would you call a leader or an up and comer who is beloved by everyone who encounters them? What are some of the words you might use to describe that kind of person?
Vladimir Zelensky.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, wait.
Charismatic.
Charismatic was exactly the word that I was thinking about. This guy is charismatic. He is Bill Clinton, you guys. Everybody sees him and they melt into his eyes. Men,
Obama.
women, it does not matter. He's got it. He's got this vibe, and people are digging his vibe. They all want to be around David. They are captivated by him. And that includes God. God is also in his presence, okay? So you might recall that in the chapter we just read, Saul says to David, okay, go with God, go fight this giant. And Saul attempts to give David his own armor, right? Very beautiful, symbolic. Here in this chapter, Jonathan also gives him his clothes. So it says here in verse 4, Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing and gave them to David together with his sword, bow, and belt. David assumes the uniform, the clothing, the position of Saul's own children here, right? He's stepping in to this world, and he's not going back home. Saul says to Jesse, your days of having this shepherd's son are over. He belongs to us now. He will live here in our house and wear our clothes, and he will become one of our warriors. So David becomes an incredibly successful warrior, And it says here, right, when the troops, so he's out to battle, he's having great success. The troops come back and everybody's singing this new song, this really popular song. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. This song is repeated over and over again in this narrative while Saul is alive, which I think is really salt on the wound. I mean, you got to put yourself in Saul's place here, right? There is this young star, this charismatic leader, and he is enchanting. Everybody is in love with him, and he's great in battle. He's amazing. And now there's this song that everybody sings about him that puts Saul down. The king. This is the king. It doesn't say King Saul has his thousands, right? It makes first it makes David and Saul equal in title, and then it pushes Saul down and says David is literally 10 times better at this than you are. So it's probably going to come as not much of a surprise that Saul's reaction in verse 8 is this. Saul was much distressed and greatly vexed. And he repeats that they're saying that David has tens of thousands, me, they only have thousands. And then this is the beautiful line, this, it's just such beautiful foreshadowing. All that he lacks is the kingship, right? Which we know as the readers is coming. We know that that's what's next. And it says, from that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Okay. So, I mean, wow. It's just so good. So, what do I want to look at right now? I want us to look at this other document. Sorry that I keep switching back and forth. Let's find it here. Okay. There. Okay. So I'm not going to make this big because we're just here for a minute. So Robert Alter comments on this, says, throughout this why does it keep doing that? I'm not happy. I'm so sorry, you guys. Throughout this pivotal episode, Saul's feelings and motives remain perfectly transparent. Here, through the narrator's report of his emotions, and in the next scene, through interior monologue. At the same time, David is pointedly left opaque. No word of his is reported when Jonathan gives him his cloak and battle gear. We know that Saul is afraid of David, but not whether David is afraid of Saul, who, after all, has tried to kill him. Spoiler alert, Saul will now continue to try to kill him for several chapters. And when David speaks in the next scene, it will be manifestly a speech framed for public occasions, which leaves his real motives uncertain. So why am I sharing this with you? Because I want us to understand that David is being portrayed in a nuanced way in our story. On one hand, we are receiving very, very positive feedback about David. David is a hero. He is successful. He's attractive. Everybody loves him. And we know that Saul is jealous of him and somewhat unstable in his behavior. But you could read this text really as David being completely in the right, blameless and pure. And Saul being the real challenge here, the real, the dangerous character. But I think what Alter is showing us, and what we will see over the course of looking at David, is that it's really not that black and white. Even from the beginning, we see that David doesn't have pure motives. He's out to make a name for himself. He's out to be successful, and he's able to achieve that and continue to do that. And the narrative is careful not to give anything away about how David is feeling or what's going on. He becomes a little bit of a mystery for us as the reader. in these next chapters of the David story, David is as aggressive as he is on the battlefield, he's passively receiving his rise to power. And by that, I mean, he doesn't ask for things. Things are just given to him. Wives are given to him. Battles are given to him. Friends are given to him. And we see this almost as like a David kind of being the lucky recipient, like the lottery winner. And Alter really questions that and says, perhaps we need to understand David not as a passive or innocent kind of bystander of his own life, but one who has an agenda and is strategic about how to be successful in this society. Any questions before I keep going? I'm like racing against the clock here.
I just have one quick question. When he fought the Philistine, how old was he?
He was a young boy.
From what I was reading, Rabbi, no older than 19 and possibly as young as 15, I think. from
Yeah,
things
we
that
don't
I've
have,
read.
we're not given a number, but that he's a young boy. He's I mean, I would say what we do know is that he's not of an age where he's going to battle, right? Like his older brothers they have all been sent off to battle. He's not, it's unusual for him to be a warrior.
So he's really a very young person with high goals and a very sophisticated way of thinking at that age.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, for sure. We could see this as I mean, certainly David is extraordinary, right? I don't want to minimize that at all. He has done something extraordinary and he continues to be impressive. I think I'm just trying to paint a little bit of a picture where he's not pure. He's not pure. He's got some motives. He's got drive. I was reading a Torah portion with my B'nai Mitzvah student yesterday. We talked about the characteristic or the sin of being ruthlessly ambitious. That Judaism doesn't really like ruthless ambition. They want you to be a mensch, right? You can be ambitious, but you also have to be a mensch. And I think, just a little bit of a spoiler alert, when we come together next time, we're going to talk about how David's ambition may have turned into a ruthless place. Betty.
Betty, you're muted.
She's trying to unmute, I can tell.
Okay, got it.
Working on it. It's all right. Take your time, Betty.
She's really off tonight.
Mm.
Weird.
Betty. Let's see. Nope, we can't hear you, Betty. Oh, there
There
you
we
are.
go.
There you are.
There
There
you
you are.
My God, I hope it's worth it. I just wanted to say, he tipped his hand a bit at the very beginning. And he said, I'll be glad to do this, but what's in it for me?
That's
What are you
right.
going to do for me? I mean, that doesn't quite fit with the picture of an innocent young boy.
That's right. Very
Yeah.
good. Great comment. I agree completely. Okay, we're out of time. Do you have like 3 more minutes for me? I just want to get to, okay. So we're just going to fast forward a little bit. Basically what happens over the next several chapters is that David continues to be successful in battle, but all the while is being chased by Saul. Saul is trying to kill him or have him killed. And interestingly, David has a bunch of defenders. Saul's children try to protect him. Jonathan tries to protect him. His wife, Michal, pushes him out a window to try to protect him. A lot of people, take pity or sympathy on David, while all the while Saul's, anger toward him, his jealousy continues to increase. And what's interesting about this dynamic between Saul and David is that, you know, like, it's not really Saul's fault that he's upset with David. Saul feels like there's a natural line of succession, and David is kind of cutting the line, right? Like, Saul's not ready to retire yet. And David, and I would argue David's not ready to be king yet, right? This is part of a journey. So, but this happens over and over again. As I said, we continue to see this line: Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. The reputation of David continues, and we start hearing in the text itself hints that everybody is expecting David to become the king. So in verse 21, the courtiers of Achish say, "Oh, there's David, king of the land." That's why they sing that song. Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And you can even hear in this language, right? It says these words worried David. Like, he knows also that that's not you shouldn't be walking around saying, "Oh, you're the king, right? You're because you kill so many people, you must be the king, not Saul." So this continues to happen while all the while David becomes stronger and stronger, and Saul becomes weaker and weaker. Eventually, Saul dies. And what happens is that David becoming king happens in steps. So first, David takes over part of the land and is appointed king of part of the region, and then the entire region. And at that point, he becomes recognized as King David. Our narrative stops calling him David, and they start calling him King David. Even when they're talking about him in relation to his friends and lovers, he is King David. This is a very pivotal moment in our text where he is known that way. So where do I want to end? I wanted to end, I don't know, on a little bit of a sour note, or a little bit of foreshadowing. One of David's major downfalls is his relationship with women. David is a little bit of a player. He is very attractive, as you all know, and he has more than one wife, which is not uncommon. It's within his right. That time things were a little different, but ultimately we start to see the role of women in his life impacting his ability to be this hero. And in next month's session together, we will get to see David as, I would say, somewhat as an anti-hero. I said the other day that if David were alive today, he would be canceled. He would be straight up canceled. What he has done cannot be undone. There's no amount of PR that could help David. He does terrible things. We will look at them next time. It will be great. But even when he's still on top of the world in this, in our time together today, we start to see the cracks show a little bit. So there's this story about the ark. One of the major narratives that we are not looking at together but exists in the David story is where the ark is at any given time. The ark is a symbol of power and control. The ark represents our relationship with God. And so our enemies will steal the ark, and then we have to steal it back. That happens over and over again in the David story. So David gets the ark from the house of Obed-Edom and brings it to the city of David, and he's rejoicing. And it says, as the ark of God entered the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, who was married to King David, looked out of the window and saw King David, not saw her husband, but saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him for it. And then she confronts him. David comes home to Michal. I'm home. I've got the ark. And she says, oh, didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself in the sight of slave girls and his subjects, as one of the riffraff might expose himself? This is where I see her like in an apron and a casserole that she's been cooking all day, and she throws it on the floor and she storms out. She gets herself a drink because she knows this man is no good and has been messing around, and she's done. She's done. She doesn't care that he's the king and that he stole the ark. She's over it. He is bad. He's bad for her. She's got, and they get into this big fight. And he challenges her and he tries to defend himself. So I just want to close with a little excerpt from Robert Alter, who comments on this, because it's wonderful. Hold on. Where is it? I'm not even going to share my screen. I'm just going to read it out loud for the sake of time. So Robert Alter points out that this is one of the only moments where we hear Michal and David speak throughout their entire marriage. And he says, we can only guess what she may have felt all those years he was away from her, acquiring power and wives, or during the Civil War with her father's family. We are equally ignorant of her feelings toward her devoted second husband. And now the royal couple are finally represented meeting, right? At this moment of triumph for David. And when Michal speaks out, it is an explosion of angry sarcasm. It says, now glory and honor splendidly returned to Israel, but the actual invocation of the term is a sarcastic one, bitterly directed at David, who will then hurl back two antonyms and try to redefine both honor and dishonor to his wife. The logic of the larger story's moral and historical realism requires that no triumph should be simple and unambiguous, that strife and accusation pursue, even in the fulfillment of national destiny. So with that, I wanted to leave you tonight. I want to thank you for being with us. It's such a good cliffhanger, I think, but you can already see that over the course of several chapters, we went from this beautiful, sweet David, this ambitious young man who really did us all a solid and killed this giant, right? Got the ark back for us, is winning battles left and right. We can see that just like in every other episode of the David story, what comes up must come down. And we are about to see that shift as David now has risen fully to power, how he will fall as a hero to us, and ultimately lose his seat of power. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode of the David story. Special thanks again to Adrienne. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
Good night, everybody.